Shalom, my bitches. My is here with NFY bringing you Humans Are Cheating Bastards by Chipathing. So, to let y'all know before we get started, I am back in Louisville, back in a new apartment actually, and so there's likely going to be traffic sounds again, and the overall quality of the recordings might decrease for here on out until I can get a better setup. So, with that understanding, let us begin. It had been 2 weeks since Dave bastardized the game I loved. 2 weeks of watching every 2-bit casual run circles around AOA club members with Dave's infernal tactics. Of course counters were found. Many of us dusted off old memory cores not used in centuries to consult the memoirs of masters. And the history of tournament-winning strategies back to the Varland's Age of Enlightenment. I was shocked to learn that before my time, Dave's strategy was common, and matches could last decades as the remaining players wore each other down in wars of attrition. A single error, a single inefficiency would result in defeat, but only years down the line. What shocked us most of all was that the father of our strategy, Alpha of Strategy Odar Gerdane of the 5th House, created the Flowing Sword strategy to wipe out fleets such as the one Dave had made. Supposedly, if dubious rumors are to be believed, he missed his only child's birth and graduation during a grueling game. Both he and his opponents had been hospitalized, and were infirm for the rest of their lives as a result. That was why he created Flowing Sword, to end matches quickly. Thus it had been perfected by younger masters and adopted as our strategy. Dave, though, he saw what we didn't. He saw us for the fools we were. He knew every action we would take before we did. We had become complacent in using a strategy that we did not understand the reasoning behind. We competed to perfect maneuvers handed down through generations. Dave played to win. It was a mistake I had learned dearly, and one I did not anticipate on repeating. What we needed was a new match, not one where Dave was alone to create his devious machine of war. We gathered around the table to begin a new game. As usual, before the game had even begun, the Nakoda were already establishing their intricate network of diplomacy and preparatory backstabs. The Bergen Wordbearer had also joined. We knew little about him other than the nature of his kind. His family was one of few that ruled over the Bergen war clans by a matter of being able to plan and think. He still carried the Bergen tradition of only speaking when needed, and in as few words as possible. When he did speak, though, each word was as thought out as it was dripping with Bergen dry wit. Then there was Dave. My skin became dark purple as we locked eyes from across the room. There was an excited energy at the table. The atmosphere was different. Fear, excitement, and stress all rolled into one. The game was set. We began. The first turn revealed some surprising results. Half my starting planets were on large gas giants with H3 in them, and I had enough habitable worlds to get a strong technology lead early on. My only concern was a lack of base materials. In the past, you were safe for the first 2 or 3 sessions, as everyone focused on rushing their technology trees and building their first capital ships. There was no such quarter in this game, though. Raids were early and frequent, as each player sought to hamper each other and take what resources they lacked. I lost many merchant vessels to opportunistic Nakoda, and even saw a prospering colony lose half its population when the Wordbearer slammed a suicide ship into it. Fortunately, each reckless tactic was too inefficient to be of use. But for every achievement in defense, someone already had a counter-strategy lined up. My only saving grace was that in the early game, ships weren't effective from orbit, so the long-forgotten mechanics of ground invasions were dusted off. With each passing turn, my head ached and my lips itched. What had once been a duel of wit and precision had become a melee without mercy. No move was too low, no tactic too cruel. My early settlements were defended from ground invasions, but my space station was under near constant attack. It was the fourth session. Buildings and equipment that had never seen extensive use were now hugely instrumental. Ground-based anti-ship guns dotted every major colony, and no mining station was complete without a military outpost. The raids became bigger and bigger as we fought to survive. Exlar was on a warpath carving through his neighboring opponents, and Dave had gone silent as he examined his territories and weighed his options. I wasn't sure what he was planning, but I didn't want a repeat of last time. I needed to ensure my place in this campaign. As it turned out, helium-3 was in short supply, and my well-defended gas giants held the main source of it. I used a researcher to found a currency backed by my H3 reserves. I was pleasantly surprised to see raids in my territory dwindle, as no one wanted to be cut off if they were found out. Everyone who wanted H3 had to play by my rules. If you didn't have helium-3, the most common forms of FTL were impossible. At least not without cumbersome technology. And when it came to decide who was allowed to get my currency, it was very convenient to leave Dave out of the trade agreement. Try fighting without FTL, Dave. I dare you. As it turns out, Dave took that as a challenge. Session 14 rolled around much as 13 had. A few players had been bumped off, including Exlar, who found out the hard way that a four-front war was not a sound military strategy. His systems were squabbled over by his neighbors, who then began to fight over his highly developed worlds. Dave still hadn't sent out an invasion fleet or a raiding party. In large part because without my H3 reserves, he was stranded. Yet he was still smiling. I hate Dave. Have I mentioned that? Because I feel it needs repeating. Players nearby Dave began to complain about FTL artillery being a nuisance, but again, I thought nothing of it. You could soften up a target with FTL artillery from the safety of your own system, but you couldn't conquer with it. Turns went by, and the occasional FTL artillery shot would hit. Again, a nuisance, and the loss of population was annoying, but not crippling. Another session went by, and suddenly Dave began rolling for his scientists. On successes, fleets appeared in player systems without provocation. My eye twitched as I tried to figure it out. He couldn't have a fleet. He'd need hundreds of years to reach the nearest planet. Rodiger fought off the invading fleet with ease, and we'd assumed that would be the end of it. If the best Dave could do was send a fleet 100 years out of date at a time, then we were confident he was merely a paper tiger. He wasn't, of course. Just throwing that out there. We seriously need to stop underestimating humans. Another turn later, an even larger fleet appeared in Rodiger's empire, and again he fought it off without casualties. I asked if I could examine one of the destroyed ships. Rodiger sent over an incomplete ship template, which simulated a wrecked ship. I was puzzled as to why a ship as small as a corvette had so many repair modules on it. One of them was an ancient first-gen version, and it only had short-range communication systems and no fuel. Only solar sails and ion engines. Even for a ship of this class, it was painfully underarmed, and its only saving grace was plentiful armor. This made no sense. Dave had rewritten the book on ship design overnight with his templates. How could someone so influential be using such woefully inadequate designs? I'd expected much more, and the fact that half of the ship was taken up by repair modules made it even more embarrassing. Even players who followed Dave's strategy agreed that repair modules were next to useless since they couldn't repair most ships quick enough to be worth the trouble. To waste half the ship's module slots on repair modules was absurd, even for Dave. Something wasn't right. 3 turns later, while I was waiting for the rest of the table to complete their own turns, I noticed I still had the ship template in my inventory. On a whim, I opened it up again, still suspicious that Dave was up to something. One thing that I had never noticed when I first examined the ship was that it had an entirely automated crew. Not automated systems, but naval protocol droids in place of crew. What was the point in taking protocol droid modules over regular crew? While they didn't require food or oxygen, their attributes were far worse than that of regular crew until late game, and even then you risked them mutinying. I knew this was the key to his plan, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly it was Dave was planning. Another turn later, 2 fleets arrived in Rodiger's empire. This time, though, they were advanced and brand new. Again with solar cells and ion engines. We all agreed it was impossible without FTL to be able to send new ships that quickly. The AI stated that no rules had been broken. Rodiger suffered minor casualties but beat back the fleets. A fleet similar to the first that Rodiger had fought off arrived in another system. Dave was getting suspicious looks. I sent out a rogue in my fastest stealth ship to find out what was going on in Dave's empire. It took an entire session for the ship to arrive. With Dave's empire being on the opposite end of the map, it's a small wonder I didn't lose the ship to an event. His planets were well colonized and had bustling high-development cities everywhere. He had transport vessels and vast networks of civilian shipyards pumping out generation ships. What was concerning, though, was the lack of any naval shipyards. What he did have, though, were the biggest, most advanced FTL artillery I'd ever seen in any game of AOA. Each turn, every available population was producing the power and ammunition needed to feed the towering guns. Every turn, at least 50 of these guns were firing. I attempted to have my rogue flee, but Dave had caught on to my scheme and dispatched a squadron of corvettes and frigates to destroy my stealth ship. I was still wondering how Dave had managed to build a fleet without shipyards. I had sent out a research vessel into Eklar's former territory to research some old weapon systems I hadn't been able to research. Perhaps my defeat had opened me up to new ideas, plasma weapons being one of them. While I skimmed the surface of an abandoned, war-torn world, the ship discovered an FTL artillery shell inbound from Dave's empire. The ship followed the shell until it hit the planet, and I rolled to investigate the impact with my researcher. It had hit the abandoned world with only a minimal population of survivors controlled by the AI pyramid. On further inspection, the shell was a tungsten jacket wrapped around a repair core with a mining probe and refinery. Dave looked at me and congratulated me on finding his weapon. I was more confused than anything. My researcher was needed elsewhere in order to research a dreadnought hull that I'd found drifting through one of the Nakoda players' territory. On a hunch, however, I left a marker on the crater and intended to research it the moment I had a chance. What had begun as a covert research project escalated into a border war between the Nakoda player and myself. I was able to salvage the dreadnought hull and signed a white peace before we were both weakened. Then I remembered the marker I had left on the crater and prioritized my research vessel to investigate. When it arrived, the planet was completely different. I'd left 10 turns ago, or about a few hours real time, and less than a year in-game. I launched a probe at the ship to see what was going on. What had once been an abandoned world was transformed into a highly developed industrial heartland, complete with shipyards producing eerily familiar ships. I gulped and ordered my research vessel to flee. It cruised at the edge of the system to warp out, but was interdicted by a patrol of automated ships. Once again, I'd lost a craft to Dave's strange ships. As if on cue, larger and larger fleets of Dave's Ghost Navy appeared and began attacking neighboring systems. Each turn, the fleets got bigger and bigger until the defenders were forced to flee with however much population they could muster. A refugee crisis had emerged on our gaming board, as more and more players were forced away from their planets. On the front lines where refugees were fleeing the Ghost Fleet, some players opted to allow their unfortunate neighbors to flee, while others blew up any transports coming into their space. In either case, the fleets kept on coming. By the time the 17th session ended, every neighboring empire to Dave was driven away or locked in a meat grinder war they had no hope of winning. However, the fleets stopped advancing, and the artillery ceased firing. Any expedition into formerly held territory was met with insurmountable numbers. Even ship designs copied straight from Dave's first game were no use against the sheer numbers. Scout ships detected Generation colony ships entering Rodiger's former territory. As the sole provider of H3 for what was left of our territory, I offered it freely to anyone who was willing to ally against Dave. Our alliance brought us closer than I'd experienced. There were no double-sided games to our agreements, and despite my better judgment, concessions were made that did not benefit me at all. We were allies, and I genuinely cared about keeping other players in the game. I knew that if we could defeat Dave here, my H3 monopoly would assure victory anyways. But against everything I'd learned, I didn't care. It wasn't about superiority. It was about my allies. Dave, you've broken me. My family is one of the 14 houses, and I was raised to lead the Varlans through decisive action and ruthless precision. While most learned to not pick at their mandibles, I was being taught to conquer empires. Why in the name of the Alpha did I care about those who were of lower station to me? Damn you, Dave! Our alliance waited and built up. Without petty politics, our unified fleet benefited from more than half a galaxy of resources. With surplus of every conceivable material, our fleets were the height of naval technology. After 20 turns, the artillery resumed. Knowing what I did, I ensured that the impacts were scoured and destroyed. Dave smiled and nodded at me as I grew wise to his plan. I would not be defeated, not by a human. I'd given up so much to ensure victory, I wasn't about to make a mistake now. The artillery continued to pound away at our planets. When scouting vessels appeared on our frontier, our fortifications annihilated them. I spread out our fleets to find out how his were infiltrating our borders. Players who'd experienced Dave's wrath began to panic. I didn't blame them. Behind my natural leadership, I was concerned. Genuinely scared even as to what Dave was planning. Our fortifications and defense armies began seeing entire bases set up in worlds that belonged to us. All entirely automated. It was all starting to click together. I'd never bothered to look into the repair module much. Any ship that was damaged could go to a shipyard or use parasite drones. A repair module was just a waste of space. But these were advanced beyond anything I'd ever seen before, capable of repairing a corvette in a turn, or in this case, turning one out. I couldn't believe it. Even deprived of the most crucial resource, he'd developed a war-winning strategy. I knew what had to be done. I assembled our fleets to their fullest strength and made the order. Reserve and garrison fleets would hunt down and destroy any replicating seat they found, while our fleets pressed forward and used our biggest advantage, FTL. It was a two-pronged war on a scale that dwarfed even my first bout with Dave. It was rather entertaining seeing Dave alone on his end of the table, surrounded on all sides by dozens of fleet cards and planet sheets. Our combined fleet fanned out and the hunt was on. A single battleship from our side was more than a match for an entire fleet's worth of ships that Dave had at his disposal. And we weren't blinded by ego and nepotism this time. We were efficient and retaking ground at a rate twice what we lost. However, as we got closer and closer to the core of Dave's territory, the fleets came in greater pace and more advanced than the last. Try as we may, with every victory we tasted defeat. Every strategy was countered in a few turns regardless of requirements. The tendrils of Dave's seed fleet cut further into our empire. No matter how quickly we replaced losses, he replaced them quicker. When we built planetary shields to protect our systems from FTL seeds, he rammed battleship-sized seed clusters into them. I spent weeks locked into a trance, unable to concentrate on anything but defeating Dave. Food had no taste, and all that I wanted to do was study the books of the Alphas before me. The ruthless efficiency of it was mind-numbing. I lost sleep. I lost weight to the point that my scholarly frame was reduced to mere skin and bones. With sullen red eyes, I returned for the match, only to find Dave sitting at the table alone, reading through a book. He wasn't smiling. He looked at me, and I could see immediately that his body was in a similar state to mine. I could see the individual veins in his eyes. It was unsettling. I asked where the others were. He motioned to the desk where there were dozens of notifications of planets ceded to me. I smiled meekly and sat down at the table opposite to Dave. I'd sat at this chair for years, ruling over it with the might of a magistrate alpha. I sighed. It didn't feel the same anymore. I asked Dave if he was ready. He agreed, and we resumed the game. It was a blur of management and perfection. I tuned my fleet much the way Dave had, and we hit each other with everything we had. The world outside didn't matter to us. Hours seeped by, night bled into day. My fingers swiped at holograms I had no recollection of seeing. My body acted independently while my mind was in a deep trance. Numbers and ideas collected in my head. Every part of my being was committed to the destruction of Dave's force. This went on until physical exhaustion overcame me, and I awoke from my trance. Dave stared at the hologram, his eyes unmoving and glossy. My body screamed for nourishment. I looked at Dave hesitantly. I asked him if he needed to take a break. The word startled Dave. He asked if I needed to take a break. We both agreed, and stumbled half asleep to the dining hall. Getting up from the chair, I felt my frame fill with fluid to bring me upright. I hadn't stood in days. I wondered how long we had been sitting here. Each step felt like a heroic feat. Dave stumbled next to me, and with a great deal of reluctance, we used each other for support while we walked to the dining hall. We passed fellow students who looked at us with confusion or amusement, sometimes both. Here we were, two students who carried each other like brothers in arms from a war zone. When we finally reached the dining hall, I felt we had ascended to a promised land. We piled our plates high and sat down at one of the secluded tables nearer to the library. Dave balanced 4 drink containers and placed them down on the table. He explained they were good for staying awake. I wasn't sure, as one of the drinks appeared to be hot enough to scald flesh, and was the coloration of feces, and the other had the appearance and taste of carbonated urine. The drinks were unpleasant, but had an immediate effect. Dave and I spoke for the first time as peers in over 2 years. Between mouthfuls of food, we discussed the game and our plans, and it became readily clear that no one was going to win without a serious commitment. I told him the story of my hero, and the infirm state that he ended up in as a result of his strategies. Dave reached out his hand as when we had first met. He offered to call it a tie. I was unfamiliar with the concept. He explained, when 2 sides of a conflict couldn't overcome the other, instead of losing more, they agreed to end the conflict without deciding a victor. It took a few explanations to get the idea, but he persisted. It finally clicked when he described it as a white piece. With a weak hand, I grasped his and shook it. As sweaty as his hand was, I still look back on that moment with fond memories. We spoke for a great deal of time over warm food and disgusting stimuli drink. We agreed on many subjects and fiercely debated on others, but one thing we had the same opinion on was that it would be a loss to not play AOA again. We'd ruined each other in a way, funny as that sounds. We were both leagues ahead of anyone in the academy, and to join the ranks of the strategy alphas required one-session games, ensuring that you'd spend much of your life locked into a game for months at a time. Simply put, we were too good for the game to result in anything more than a tie without committing our lives to a game we would no longer enjoy. It was the story of Olwind the Immortal all over again. Two immortal brothers trapped forever in a duel, neither willing to surrender and unable to die. The only winning move was to not play at all. We ended up leaving the club after that. To my surprise, membership enrollment spiked when we left. Perhaps the prospect of being able to win a game drew the casual players out of the shadows. Dave and I still visited whenever there were sessions in progress. We would give out advice to the players, which they would inevitably follow. We kept track of dozens of games at a time, watching how they would play out. Our only rule was that we could not tell them what to make, only advise them and give ideas. We competed in our own way still, finding rivalries and guiding them from behind the chair. When we got too invested, we would remove ourselves from the table and watch the results. It was in the final 2 years of the academy that our legacy was solidified. At any time of the day, there would be a dozen players at our heels, asking us to examine their strategies, their ships, their planets. Believing a yes or no answer would be enough for them to win any match they played. It got so bad that lecturers had to forbid anyone from speaking to us, so that the entire lecture hall wasn't overtaken. Though it didn't help when it was the lecturer themselves who was asking one of us for guidance. The sight of one of us watching a game would make each player double down on their efforts, speak loudly of their own strategies and accomplishments. When we did offer our advice, we learned quickly that if one of us gave advice at the table, the other would be sought after to balance the odds. We took advantage of this from time to time, and would give cryptic advice to players, so we could see what happened. Our little experiments were recorded by Dave, who had logged them all, and as one other human put it, "He's become the Erwin Sukan of AOA." When we graduated that year, we did so with honors. Not being locked into matches for days at a time allowed us to catch up and then some. After the ceremony, we accepted our ceremonial swords. I introduced Dave to my family, and me to his. After that, we agreed to never allow our families to interact with one another ever again. The blood between humans and Varlants was still as bad as Dave had expected. The prospects for us were endless, though I doubt that graduation will be the last we see of each other. I just hope that when we do meet, we're on the same side. Of all the things I've learned at my time in the academy, never underestimate a human had to be the hardest lesson of all. Alright guys, so to continue the update from the beginning of this video, I am back at school, going into my master's year, and yeah, I'm in a new apartment. An apartment with a much louder AC system, and so yeah, there's probably going to be some background noise, sorry for that, I'll do my best to get rid of that. Luckily, though, I am on a much less traveled street than last time, so there will be less vehicle noise going around. Thank you guys so much for your patience, and if you would like to hear more of my stuff, go ahead and subscribe. If you enjoyed what I did here today, go ahead and leave a like. And if you want to be notified of when I put out some more stuff, hit the notification bell on the side. And with that, have a nice one, y'alls.